Hi. Thank you for coming to my talk. My name is José Joaquín Atria. I'm the other JJ, and I'm going to be talking about exploring game programming patterns in Perl 5. A little housekeeping: the links to these slides and to the project that I've been working on are there. They're also on the talk page in the conference website. Some acknowledgements. First of all, thank you to my employer, CV Library. I work with them in London, and they've given me time to come here. Also, we're hiring, so if you want to work in London, why not come? So full disclaimer, I might not be the best person to give this talk because I'm not really a game developer, at least not yet. I've only really started with this, but it is something that I'm interested in. So why should I give this talk? Well, because we don't really see these talks, and I'm a firm believer that you should give the talks that you'd like to see. So I want to see more talks like this. So follow my lead. And why should all of us, I guess, care about games? I think this should answer itself. Actually, the first thing I did when I touched a computer was play video games, and the first thing I wanted to write when I started writing code was a video game, and I still do both. And from a more practical perspective, games are very attractive to newcomers, and they're really interesting to write. They pose interesting questions, and they wrap them up in this neat little fun package. So they're a good place to try out new ideas and try out new things. A little history about the talk. Back in February, I decided that I was going to try and clone a game that I liked. And I had done a little bit of playing around with Love and Pico 8, which are Lua-based game development frameworks. But I figured, why not try Perl 5? And sadly, I am going to be talking only about Perl 5. There's some really interesting stuff going on with in Perl 6, and particularly with game development in Perl 6. There's been some attempts to write game engines and some little games being developed here and there. I just wish I had more time to get into that. When I started looking at this talk, I figured I should look at what other people had written. And I found that there's actually more than I expected. So these are some honorable mentions of games that have been developed in Perl. Nation States is a video game. It's a browser-based nation simulation game that was started in 2002, and it has a very large and thriving community. It received a cease and desist letter from the United Nations, actually. Just a couple of days ago, it had 150,000 active nations. These are nations that get deactivated if there's not be any updates for 28 days. So these are fairly recent numbers. And of course, I have my own nation. My economy needs some work, but other than that, I think we're doing pretty well. And of course, there's South Station, which is another browser-based sci-fi MMORPG. Which is we can ask all these questions to Ovid instead. But it's a new and very exciting game, and actually there's a lot of interesting tech that has been coming out of this, and a lot of interesting talks that have been given at recent conferences about this. So it's definitely something to take a look at. It does require a little bit more commitment than nation states, so that's probably why my character page looks very empty, but it does look very pretty, so you should definitely check it out. And there's these are some other browser-based games that have been developed in Perl. Some of these reached sort of peak activity and then disappeared, like the Lacuna Expanse and Keno Antigen, which was a community reboot. But yeah, so all of these are browser-based games, and I'm not really surprised that this is the case, that the most successful Perl games are browser-based, because first of all, deployment is not really an issue. You don't need to worry about distributing Perl code, and you don't need to worry about when you do it, revealing the source code of your game so that people could, game it. But this is not really what I'm trying to build, so this is just a sort of honorable mention, a tip of the hat to other people who are doing similar things. So what are the relevant, I think, games that have been written in Perl? And these, I'm thinking, sort of fairly complete ones. The first one is Frozen Bubble. The first time I played this game, I didn't know it was written in Perl, and this is actually a comment in the source code. It was developed between 2001 and 2008. And it's very widely distributed, very well received. You can install it on your own machine using your package manager of choice, and it just works. It is written with a relatively low-level SDL code, so it just basically talks to the SDL functions directly. So it might not be the best example to follow when you're writing your new game, but it definitely proves that you can build a game, release it, distribute it, and then have several 100,000 people playing it all over the world. Another example that I would like to point out is Microidiom, which is an unreleased Luftrausers clone, which is very different. I would suggest you play this video if you have some time later. The architecture is basically separating a client and a server, so it supports multiplayer, and it uses SDL, OpenGL, and PDL for some so relatively sophisticated number crunching. It looks really impressive. It moves really fluidly, and yeah, it looks really good. I really hope that this continues. So back to what I was trying to write. When I started, I figured I should search for an engine that I could use. And the thing about Perl game engines, particularly the ones that sort of apply to what I was looking for, is that there are a lot out there, a lot of different projects and a lot of different approaches to it. These are the ones that I could find sort of lying around in GitHub. GameFrame has been used for like one project written by the same author. March tries to do some fancy things with concurrency. Arces is built on its own sort of object system that tries to implement the entity component system. Avenger is made by the same people who make the SDL releases, and it's a sort of an attempt at building a platform that is similar to the ones that I mentioned at the beginning, like Love and such. But the one thing that all of these have in common is that none of them are finished and none of them are released. Some of these seem pretty abandoned. So there isn't really a Perl game engine that you can use and just jump in. The best one out there is SDLX app, I think. And it's not really an engine itself, it's just a way to use the SDL sort of framework. And the good things is that, hey, it's on cpan, so you can actually install it. And if you install SDL, you already have it. It has a lot of convenience methods, so you don't have to worry about some of the tricky bits about, say, implementing game loops, or like all of that is already there. And there are lots of existing examples. If you bump into someone writing a game in Perl, they're probably using this. Well, unless they're writing like a browser-based game, like the ones I mentioned. And the last commit to the project was last year, so it's receiving some attention still. But the interface can get a bit clunky, and the documentation could be improved. Particularly the documentation tends to not really talk about SDLX app so much, but about the SDL functions that are underlying. So it can definitely sort of lead you into bits that you know are there and you want to use, you just don't know how. But still, I think that this will work for me. So what is it that I'm trying to put together? So the game that I was trying to clone just for kicks was Invisible Ink, which is a turn-based, sort of top-down 2D stealth tactic game. Those are a lot of buzzwords. And just in terms of like how I'm setting up the code, I'm using Cartoon and cpan file to manage my dependencies, which allows me to keep all of my stuff separate from everything else. Very soon after I started writing the game, I figured that it was a good idea to keep the engine code and the game code separate. And since I'm using some modules that I'm developing separately, and I haven't released yet, I'm using this feature where I can just put them into a vendor directory and just manage them like any other dependency. And I'm following regular release patterns with that so that I can keep track of which version I'm using in the game and which version I have while I'm developing this for something else. And this has been working really well for me. So here I had a diagram of the sort of high-level 10,000-foot view of my of what I'm trying to build, and I'm glad that I put an alt title. So basically, what it has is a game object at the top that connects to some sort of event source that currently is SDL, but I would like to be able to plug it in to say something like libcaca or something else. And then the game also has a stage, which could be a menu or a game level or anything else. That stage will have entities, buttons, actors, all sorts of things. And then when the game loads that stage, it hooks it up to that event source and then just pipes all of the input events and everything else. So when it comes the time for the game to load a different stage, it can just unhook it from the event source, get rid of it, load in a new one, and hook it up. So that's the main design, I guess. And part of what I wanted to do in this talk was talk about programming patterns, because when I started trying to figure out how to build a game, I came across this book called Game Programming Patterns by Robert Nystrom, which is a gem of a book. First of all, it's free online, so you can read it before you buy it. And it's a collection of patterns that are found in games that make for better code. And I'm going to be focusing mainly on 3 programming patterns. 2 of these are not actually sort of his patterns or patterns that he's described, but are patterns that come from the literature. But he does a very good job of explaining how they apply to game development. So the flyweight pattern is basically, if you have a lot of objects that are going to be similar, you can take away the part that is shared and just make it once, and then keep all of the state that is instance specific in the instances, and then point everything to this other shared object, this intrinsic state. And the example in the book is, say, take a grid of tiles. So some of those tiles will have different terrains, like, say, grassland tiles or mountain tiles. And all of the mountains will be similar. So you can keep the mountain bit in one place, and then keep instance-specific things, like, say, is it occupied, or where in the map is it, in a separate place. And my game will have grids. It won't have terrains, but it will have sprites and other things that are shared across cells. And to define them, I'm using these files that are called TMX files, which is like an XML-based sort of tile set and tile file. And there is actually a parser for these files in cpan, Games TMX parser, which uses the same sort of architecture that I'm using for my map class. Which looks a bit like this. So you have a grid, and then the grid has a list of, like a tile set that will have a list of tiles, and then you have a set of layers, and then each of the layers will have a set of cells, and the cells will point to the tiles. So if I show you maybe something in code which is clearer, you'll have like a tile set which has an array of tiles, and then you have a cell that links to that tile. And if you use the handles feature in Moo, you can actually make this connection transparent. The user never needs to know that these objects are different. And the benefits are that there's, you use less memory, you keep the shared properties shared, and you can even use the same sort of pattern if you're using generated content. So if you have like a map generator that will not actually use the map files, you can still use the tile sets. Another pattern that I ended up using is the observer pattern, which basically the idea is that you can announce that something has happened without caring who is listening. And actually there's a lot of modules on CPAN that do this. If you search for emitter, you get about 63 different results. My current favorite is beam emitter, which allows you to use it like most of the other libraries around, where you can just pass a plain list of arguments, like say Mojo event emitter. But beam emitter prefers to use event objects, and this brings with it the killer feature that events can be stopped. So say you have an emitter that implements that role, you can instance it, and then you can add an event handler to say a tick event. And then that handler will receive an event object that keeps a sort of information about who emitted it and all that stuff. And you can stop it within that handler. And then when you emit the event, you get the event back. And that's the event that has been fired to all of the listeners. So you can check what the state was after passing through all of these listeners. And another interesting feature of this library is that when you actually subscribe to an event, you get back a subref that you can call to unsubscribe from it, which is really handy for me. So some like a little more realistic code example. This is the code that I have to load a stage. So you basically take the stage, and the stage has a bunch of handlers itself. So you connect them over to the event source. You collect all of those unsubscribers into something that you can keep for later, and then if it exists, you unsubscribe the previous one and load in the next one. And this allows me to just switch the stage on the fly and make sure that it's not sort of still around somewhere that I can't reach it. And this allows me to control the event's lifespan. So for instance, if I fire a key event and some actor somewhere jumps, I can mark that event as already handled, and nothing else gets it. The one thing that I would like to have is to be able to forward an event, so the event would receive, the class would receive an event and then pass it on as is to something else. I have implemented my own version, but it would be neat if the library supported this use case. And the last pattern that I would mention is the component one, which is this entity component system pattern, which is all the rage in game development. And if you look at sort of how it's defined, this is from the Entity Systems Wiki. An entity is a container into which components can be added, and a component is a class of objects through which behaviors, looks, and data can be added to an entity. So roles, basically, they're talking about roles. And we have great support for roles in Perl. So you can do it like this. You define the class and you just load in the components at compile time. Or you can actually just define the class at runtime and bring in these roles from a config file somewhere, which would allow you to basically say, for instance, define actors without actually, define different types of actors without actually having to touch the code, which is great. So can you write games in Perl 5? Well, you absolutely can. And there's loads of examples, not just the browser games that we know are successful, but even the ones that, like the one that I'm trying to build, which are sort of locally run. But I just wish that getting started would become a little easier. Things that could help, I think having a modern documented game engine would be a huge step forward. And maybe Avenger seems to me to be the best bet, but maybe something new would also work. And having more examples out there and more community participation and events to give that participation some visibility would be great too. And actually there was an SDL Perl game contest. I got to it maybe 8 years too late, but there were 6 participants, 16 submissions. The idea was to submit 1 game per week for a month, and it sounds like a lot of fun. We should do it again. These are all stuff that I haven't resolved, but I think they are, if you are trying to develop a game in Perl, you probably should be thinking about how to distribute it and whether performance might be a problem, and I guess the profit too, but that's too far from me. Thank you. Any questions? Thank you. Oh, sorry. So the question is how far I've gone with my game. I'm afraid to say that you can actually see for yourself. It's on the you can go to the repository, but I'm able to draw, like if you start the game, you get a menu that allows you to start the game. So that's testing whether you can load a different stage. And once you load the stage, you have, I have an actor in a screen that has animated sprites, and you can select it and move it around the screen. I haven't fully implemented like line of sight algorithms and stuff like that, but I'm getting there. So the question is it possible to use this with the OpenGL stuff that has been, the OpenGL work that has been done in Perl? And yes, Microidiom, the game that I mentioned, that uses OpenGL, and it looks amazing. I think that's all the time. Oh, sorry. Well, so the question is that in the entity component system pattern, you have the components themselves don't define behaviors. It's the systems that define the behaviors, and the components just add data together. And the fact so there's nothing that from that prevents you from using roles for that. If your roles only have data in them, only define say attributes, and just load them into your class, then you're just adding data, not behavior. And then you can have the system somewhere else that will check whether a particular class does a role to check whether this this class has that component in it. I haven't gotten that far yet, but when I started thinking about how the ECS was implemented in different places, in different languages, it seemed that a lot of the hoops that they were trying to jump through, we don't really have them. Like it seems to me that in Perl, Perl is a particularly well-suited language for this. I think that's it. Thank you.